So I hope everybody's excited today. We've got a great keynote coming up. We've got some lightning talks. We've got some panel discussions. One of the things that I've been really interested in, and I know that a lot of people that we've reached out to today is, yes, we're creating and using open educational resources, and they're creating a lot of savings. And people are getting free things in the classroom, but how is it changing the nature of what's happening within the classroom? So how is it now making changes and affecting what teachers and students are doing within what they're doing within the classroom? So that's one of the key things that some of the discussions are going to talk about, that we're going to be talking a little bit about today. I'd also like to do a land acknowledgement today. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. So it's important to me to make this land acknowledgement today. It's the first one I've ever done for SFU, so it's really important for me to do it. And I believe it should have been the very first thing that I said, but it's important for me to make sure that I get that out there. We're really excited to have Dr. Juan Alperin as our keynote speaker today. He is an assistant professor at the School of Publishing at Simon Fraser University. He is the associate director of research for the Public Knowledge Project and co-director of the Scholarly Communications Lab. He is a multidisciplinary scholar with training in computer science, social science, and education, who believes that research, especially when it is made freely available, has the potential to make meaningful and direct contributions to society. Dr. Alperin has contributed to a combination of conceptual, methodological, and empirical peer-reviewed articles and presentations in leading journals and conferences, as well as edited 2 volumes on scholarly communication topics. So if we get a hand to Dr. Juan Alperin. Thank you. I'll cross over this way. Yeah, great. Thank you, Juan.
Perfect. Did I get the mic going correctly?
Yeah.
Perfect.
I'll turn mine off.
Great. So good morning, everyone. It's really good to be here, actually. It's always very convenient when I get to do these kind of events in the building in which I work. So I just popped in downstairs. If you're wondering where the Scholarly Communications Lab is, we're just up on the 7th floor. So you're all welcome to come up and sit there and come up and visit us there. Then it's also nice to sort of do these in the same classrooms where I teach. So it's sort of very situational around, and I'm going to talk about some of the things that I do in my own classrooms and get a chance to do this in the very classrooms in which I practice some of these things I'll be talking to you about. It's also very good that most of you sat in the back row, so that way it really replicates the experience of having the students in the class. I want to begin by sort of first acknowledging that I'm not an expert on open pedagogy or open education, and I think I also want to sort of show you I'm also not necessarily the greatest educator myself. And so although I have a PhD in education, and my doctoral work is really focused on scholarly communications issues and open access, and most of what I've learned about higher education has been sort of happened both in the classroom with myself as a student doing my PhD in education, and then just through practice of trying to be a teacher for several years. There are many others, I think, including probably many of you that are here today, that actually know more about open pedagogy and open education, its history, its related practices, and most importantly, many of you probably have actually more experience at implementing some of these practices successfully in the classroom. So, I mean, while after having confessed this, you might be wondering why I was invited to speak here today, or you might even be wondering why it is that I felt sort of bold enough to accept the invitation. And so while I can't speak to the former of why they invited me, I'm always still sort of always caught off guard when I get invited to give a talk or speak somewhere else. I can certainly speak about the latter of why I accepted. I have a deep commitment myself on making knowledge public and in open pedagogy practices, and I see these 2 things as sort of being interconnected. So I think that they both support each other, and that we need one to make the other happen. And I'm also convinced that there's actually a lot of benefits and that there's of having open practices in the classroom, starting, of course, with the benefit that the students themselves perceive in terms of what it does for their learning. And I've experimented quite a bit. So it's this deep commitment, and the amount of experimentation and the things that I've done in the classrooms that I think sort of made me want to come and speak and be able to share some of these experiences. And so for those of you that know about these things better than I do, and you will hopefully be able to benefit from listening to the experiences and around how it is that I've tried to put these things in practice and some of the challenges that I faced. And so that you'll be able to think as you try to promote and share and try to encourage others to practice open pedagogy about what are some of the challenges and shortfalls and what are actually some of the consequences that come with trying to experiment with these things, so that as you try to promote these practices with others or in your own classrooms, you just have that perspective of someone who is really well-meaning and is deeply committed to these things, but that has maybe not had that, maybe hasn't always been successful in getting these things to happen. And for those of you that are just curious about open pedagogy and open practices, maybe you'll also just hear sort of like I'll sort of go through some of the lists of the different things that I've tried to do in my own classrooms, and you can maybe just get inspired or get some ideas at things that you might want to experiment with today. So this is my plan for the time that I have here today. I will now sort of begin by outlining a little bit some of my thinking and the purpose of why I think we have public education in the first place and why open pedagogy and open education I think are important, which is largely informed by my time in the classroom. And I think I'm going to be drawing a little bit on the work of David Labouré, who's a historical sociologist of education at Stanford, and the things that he's taught me while there, and a little framework for thinking about open pedagogy and the public purpose of education in the first place. And then I'm going to share with you some of the things that I've done and experimented in my own classrooms, and finally read to you some of the feedback that I've gotten from students and some of the feedback that I've gotten in my own sort of salary reviews around the things that I've done in open pedagogy. And so this last part, I think you'll sort of forgive for a little bit of a spoiler, will sort of give you an appreciation of some of the challenges faced, like for faculty such as myself, on trying to do some of these things differently, because that feedback is not universally positive, as So let me start a little bit by talking about the public purpose of higher education, because I think this is, at least for me, this is sort of what drives me to try to do some of these practices, is around conversations around these things. And I think that we have a lot to sort of learn around how we frame and how we try to incorporate different open practices in our classroom if we're trying to keep in the back of our minds of why it is that we are working sort of in an open way in the first place. And here I also need to acknowledge and thank Luke Terra, who was a PhD student with me at Stanford when I was studying education. So we were both sort of there at the same time. He's now the Director of Community Engaged Learning at the Harbour Centre for Public Service. And like me, Luke was also a student of Labouré, but he clearly learned some of the lessons better than I did, because when I invited him to speak in a class last fall, he did so in such a he sort of explained like David's framework and way of thinking about this thing so sort of clearly that I realized that I needed to strive for the same simplicity in explaining this framework next time I had an opportunity to do so. So here I go. So I want to just acknowledge that I've sort of taken some of the notes and things that I've from when Luke came to my class, and I'm now going to try to echo some of those back to you. But before I do, before I start sort of cribbing from Luke and from David, I want to start by just even asking you, and as I did when I ran the President's Dream Colloquium on Making Knowledge Public, which is we ran last fall. I ran as a course, and when I first had the students come into the classroom, the first thing I asked them was, why do we publicly fund higher education, right? So in Canada, it's certainly true, but also pretty much anywhere else in the world, we put some degree of like funding and resources subsidizing higher education. We give universities actually like money for every student that they have in the classroom. We give universities tax breaks, right? Saying like they get to be sort of tax exempt institutions. We certainly fund research activities that happen in higher education. Actually, so governments are the largest sort of research funders out there. But why? We've obviously have determined that subsidizing higher education it benefits the public and is a benefit to society. But what's the argument for doing so? So I want to start by asking that question and actually getting some answers from some of you. Why do you think that we have decided? What's the argument for diverting funds from the public and putting it towards higher education? Who wants to give us some answers? You're looking like you might have one? No? Yes?
I think now it's more economic than anything else.
Mm-hmm.
For students, for the workforce, and create knowledge, and that can be applied to generate economic growth.
Right. certainly there's an economic argument around equipping students for the labor force, right, in some way, and giving them the skills that they need to get a job. Someone else want a different argument? Access. In which, can you just elaborate a little bit?
So possibly in the past, multiple people to go to university instead of funding, it alleviated some of the tuition costs that it would cost if we didn't have it. Like private universities cost a lot more. And so more people have access to more education that feeds into society.
Right, so it's about educating the public, so it's around giving access to it. Just I'm sort of repeating for those that for the recording. So and just to make sure that I've understood. So like subsidizing to give access because we want to have an educated society, and that having just a general increasing the knowledge base of the society around us is somehow a benefit. And we could continue to dig into that around what is the advantages of why do we want to, what kinds of knowledge, and what is the benefit that we derive from that. Let's get a couple more. I think there's lots of arguments to be made. So. Yeah, back, no? That was Mr. Van.
To promote research that will eventually lead to the improvement of society.
Right, so advancing knowledge for innovation to sort of hopefully lead towards innovation, because innovation, we then get benefits directly from the innovations themselves. Those can be both economic benefits, social benefits, or health benefits, right, in different ways, depending on the area of work. We need to try to liven up here. We have other arguments that we can put towards it. Yes, thank you.
Keep young adults out of the workforce so they're not competing for jobs.
So a very different kind of an economic argument is sort of. So I can certainly say that this is that line of thinking and arguing is certainly around what does putting people into in educational institutions does around the organizing of the labor force is more than just actually putting people in skills. If you think around the way that we structure schooling in the first place is certainly guided by making sure that enabling the parents of those children to be able to go to work. So the reason that the school day is as long as it is and it's those hours is not because we've determined that it's actually the best thing for student learning. It's actually determined that's the best thing to help adults get to work and be productive in society. So I think that we could maybe think about extending that same sort of line of arguing around structuring society in a way for education to help us then do the other activities that have nothing to do with education in the first place. Let's get one or two more, and then I'll continue with my remarks.
Is it in the legislation, or like I'm thinking like government framework as opposed to the U.S., right? That's why so many of the U.S. students come here because tuition is cheaper, and so.
Right. I mean, certainly Canada has a different funding model for education than the U.S. does, and so we, for example, haven't, unlike in the U.S., tied K through 12 funding to local property taxes the way that it's done in the U.S. because of the way that it's regulated. So here in Canada, I think we have taken on a stronger stance for saying that we need that education should be publicly funded. And the question sort of that I'm asking is like, why has Canadian society, through our laws and through our government, have decided that this is something that we should be doing? So let me let me say that when I asked the students, so I had this course last semester where I had students that had taken a whole class on the topic of making knowledge public. The students actually came in and gave me all kinds of very sort of altruistic answers around sort of helping students to become better citizens, around advancing human knowledge, and they all came in with much less, with a less, I would say, maybe perhaps cynical perspective around the economic value of education. And that's, I think, it's very important for us to I was kind of expecting, when I was curious what you would answer, I was kind of expecting that being here in an open education sort of event, I was going to get the same kind of very sort of optimistic and very rosy-eyed view of what education achieved for society. And it's very interesting that we didn't. And that's actually going to lead very nicely into the arguments and the conversation that I want to have. So let me pull now from Labour's sort of framework for thinking about these things. He sort of talks about three different competing purposes for higher education. The first is democratic equality, right? The second is social efficiency, and the third is social mobility. And I want to just sort of break those down a little bit for you. So from the democratic equality perspective, schools are sort of intended to develop an informed and capable citizenry. Right? This comes in the form of knowledge and critical thinking skills to make decisions, right? So this is a little bit what was being sort of proposed, right? We want to have citizens that have both the ability to have the information necessary, but also be able to think about it and process it in different ways, but also the social disposition to work collectively, right? And Luke, when he came into the classroom, used the example of the parent-teacher conference, and when any of you that are parents that have gone into these things, you know that you can often go in and you first ask about how the students are doing academically in their subjects, are they learning well? But then you also are interested in knowing how the child is doing in terms of how well they're getting along with others. Do they listen to what the teacher is asking them to do? Do they actually work together? Do they behave? Right? So these are also questions, and part of the function of schooling is also to sort of socialize and socialize individuals into working as part of a collective or being able to work and get along well with others. Under this category, so we have the arguments that schools give people a shared sense of purpose, right? And also give us an equal opportunity to make decisions and to participate in society. And the schooling is a way of sort of putting everyone on having shared values, but also having sort of equal levels of skill and ability so that everybody can participate in being, in leading a society or in making decisions for a society. The social efficiency perspective is a little bit different, right? From this perspective, the purpose of schools are not just to prepare individuals to participate or engage in democratic actions, but rather to fulfill efficient economic roles. That's a little bit what we got as sort of as the first answer, right? In this group, we would place arguments that schooling should be equipping individuals to fulfill economic functions, jobs, right, that are needed in society. And that is that public funds should be allocated to schools to train individuals to carry out the jobs that are in demand in the market. And here you'll find those that are calling for like slashing or the lack of attention to the arts and humanities, and probably most of the social sciences, except for economists, which are the only social sciences that often people think that we still need a lot of. And as Luke put it when he came to my class, is that when democratic efficiency comes from the perspective of the citizen, social efficiency sort of gets us to think about the perspective of the taxpayer. Right? And so the taxpayer is interested in having these functions being fulfilled around them and having society sort of work so that they get the benefit, but they're getting the benefit by having all of these different roles properly fulfilled so that whatever they want, there's somebody out there that's equipped to do those jobs. Right? And then the third comes sort of my most loathed of the three perspectives, right? And so here I have taken I clearly have a stance around which perspective I sort of subscribe to why I want to see education argued. The social mobility is certainly not the one that I advocate for. But I think it's also probably the one that is most commonly found today, and the argument, the perspective that we hear most about. From the perspective that schools are supposed to serve the individual by allowing them to personally gain a better position in society, or in many cases maintain the advantageous positions that they already have. Right? This perspective leads to sort of a form of credentialism, right? That students can use to gain social advantage. Right? That's the universities are supposed to help them or provide them with a degree that's going to help them to actually, for them to get ahead in society, right? For them to be able to move up the social ladder. And then, in that sense, education becomes valuable not just for the development of human capital, right, for the knowledge that the students are supposed to be walking away with, but for its exchange value, right? Which brings sort of the market logic to universities, where students start seeing themselves as consumers of education, which lends the universities sort of to competing with each other around rising in rankings, which become a market signal of the value of a degree, right? So what are rankings if not actually a position to say, like, what is a degree from this university worth to me as an individual as compared to this other university that's a little bit further down in the rankings, right? When you start thinking about from the individual perspective of what am I going to gain, it really starts setting up a conversation around the education I'm getting is around what can I then trade it in for once I leave the university. Right? Here I could go on a very long tangent about sort of the Neoliberal University and how these effects of this kind of logic and thinking actually starts permeating into all kinds of other aspects of what happens at universities. Both from what I actually spend most of my time thinking about and doing is thinking about how these things play around in the in the realm of research, the logic around like studying the impact of journals and where people publish and how this versus sort of which questions get asked and who gets to participate in creating research in the first place. But if I was to go off on that tangent, I would be sort of fulfilling what some of my course evaluations always say, that I'm a very enthusiastic teacher, but that I ramble at times. So I'm going to try to stay away from going off on that long tangent about, that's really where I spend most of my time thinking about. So to get back to my topic, let me sort of say that these perspectives are not, they're competing with each other, but that doesn't mean that they're not completely at odds with one another, right? An individual seeking social mobility might be focused on attaining a particular skill for a high-paying job, right? So they might be really for a job that's in high demand. And so that a student that's really subscribing to, or if we bring in this perspective of the social mobility, might still mean sort of jumping on to also thinking about education and justifying it by saying these are the jobs that are in demand, and so equipping students to go into those high demand jobs is both fulfilling an economic efficiency, but also fulfilling a social mobility perspective. But I mean, in some sense, also this is a sign that that social efficiency perspective is also dominated by a market logic, right? And then I could, again, go off on a tangent again about the challenges that I have around thinking about that market logic in education. But what I'm really wanting to draw your attention to is that the rationale of why we have education in the first place matters. It matters around not just what we teach, right? Around thinking about which subjects and which skills and which things that we put into the classroom. But I think it also matters about how we teach it. And as I will come sort of to describe, it affects how students perceive their educational experience. Right? So how we think about these things as educators is also affecting and shapes how the students see themselves within the education system and their role in society. And it's also going to come, and this is part of the argument that I'm trying to make, it also affects how people from outside the university, people that are not the students or the educators, are also perceiving what it is that's going on here. And this starts to undermine an argument for why we should be having these institutions and these places in the classroom in the first place. I want to sort of highlight it before I move on to sort of talking about pedagogy, open pedagogic practices in the classroom, is that from the main difference between sort of the democratic and social efficiency perspective and that of social mobility. Right? While the former two see education as a public good, right? Something that the costs of doing education need to be shared by everybody, right? Through public funds. And the benefits are also shared by society as a whole, whether you're thinking about it from informing a citizenry or thinking about it from making sure that all jobs have someone allocated to them, right? That's a benefit to a society as a whole, right? Whereas the social mobility really starts to kind of change that logic and starts thinking about the benefits of education as accruing at the individual level, right? And from that sense, it starts to really undermine the argument for why we should have public funding for education in the first place. If education really is about the individual gaining a personal benefit, then we start to get into an argument that then the individual should be the one that can bear the cost. And this is a little bit what we see, certainly in Canada, but it's a lot more pronounced in the US around the way that student loans and sort of student assistance programs are structured, right? Instead of being around providing students with sort of scholarships or funding them or subsidizing the education altogether, you start saying, well, they're going to get the benefit so they can incur costs, which they can then pay off once they graduate, they get their credential, they go trade it in for some high-paying job, and then they can pay off that debt. And so that really starts to undermine the argument for public education in the first place. This is a lot of what sort of, I think, then we start seeing the arguments. Kathleen Fitzpatrick, who was here not too long ago, sort of talking and promoting her most recent book, Generous Thinking. So she makes sort of the argument in the book that says to restore public support for our institutions and our fields, and here she's focused primarily on the humanities, but I think you can think about this as a very sort of general, for any field or any subject that you're interested in. So she says, we must find ways to communicate and make clear the public goals that our fields have and the public good that our institutions have, right? And so again, what I'm trying to get us to think about the different perspective of why we have public education and what is some of our responsibilities is really also is about supporting the work that the institutions as a whole do. Because if we don't bring in a perspective that is different than that of the individual accruing the benefit from education, then we're undermining the whole enterprise of everything that's happening at universities. And so as I sort of turn to talking a little bit about the practices of things that I do in my classroom, I want us to be thinking about these different ways of justifying why it is that we're doing this whole exercise in the first place. Because a lot of what motivates me to do this kind of work is about shifting a little bit the model of thinking about why, and trying to shift both from the student's perspective, but also from the perspective of what society on the outside is going to be seeing from what it is that we do. Okay, so this is where I stop pretending that I actually am an education scholar, which I'm certainly not. And so thank you, both Luke and David, for giving me enough to talk about there to be able to give us some framing for what it is that I really want to spend my time talking about. Is why I practice open pedagogy in the classroom and what are some of my experiences in doing that. And here now I can then start claiming to be an expert in the thing that what I do. Not an expert in how I achieve it, but just that at least I know what I did, and I can tell you about it, okay? And importantly, why. So there's no doubt I'm actually in that first camp. So the reason that I do open pedagogy, the reason I like open education, the reason I dedicate my research and most of my time that I'm doing thinking about public knowledge is because I want to impart on students a sense that they both can and that I actually have an obligation to engage with the world around them through their intellectual pursuits, right? I want to empower them to be publicly engaged citizens, right, after they leave the university. And so when I do that from the perspective of the research that I do is around creating more research that's publicly available, is around making sure that people that are wanting to be engaging in society have access to the resources for them to do so, that they can access the knowledge that's been produced. So as I study and I research the public's use of research, and I actively advocate for a greater access to research outputs, under that belief, and this is where it's going to sound familiar from my bio a few minutes ago, right? It's under the belief that when research is made freely available, it has the potential to make meaningful and direct contributions to society. So there's a big, strong public knowledge element to the work that I do and to the way that I approach it. And what I've dedicated my career to now, not all 5 years of it, have been to really sort of pushing a public knowledge agenda, because I believe that it's about making sure that the people out there can make informed decisions and that they should have access to the best and most recent knowledge that's been made available. All of this sort of is in part out of a desire to build a case sort of for public support for education in the first place, right? Because I sort of strongly believe that public education is important, and that I think that we need to make sure that the work that we're doing is justifying not to ourselves, but rather to those that are beyond the educational boundaries, right? Those that have already gone through school, that education is worth supporting. I try to do this both from what I do in my own classrooms, within the people that I have the most direct contact with, the students. And this is very similar to those of you that have spent any attention in the open education space, sort of the philosophy that Robin DeRosa sort of brings to the work that she does around sort of justifying bringing a justification for public education through interactions and working with the students directly. And then I try to do it also from the perspective of trying to change academia and trying to change higher education more broadly. And this maybe, if you want another sort of reference there, this is a little bit Kathleen Fitzpatrick, and the argument that she's making in the book Generous Thinking is very much around changing the work of faculty and the work of universities as a whole, again, as a way of making sure that we are really justifying to society why it is that we're here in the first place and why we should be supported. So I've been doing this, again, through my work with the Public Knowledge Project and the promotion of open access, but it really wasn't until, and so I've been doing that for about 10 years now and promoting open access to research for quite a long time, but it was not until I arrived at SFU in 2014 that I began making my own classroom sort of more open and more democratic. So let me now turn to talking a little bit about my own efforts. And I should say that I don't know where I got the hubris to start trying out these things in my classroom when I started here in 2014 of trying to do all of these experimentation things as I was still myself a graduate student. I started before I even completed my PhD. I'd been a TA once, and I jumped into a classroom and I decided that I would start experimenting with all kinds of things in my classrooms. And I don't know why I felt sort of emboldened enough to start before even figuring out how to teach in a more traditional way, saying, let me throw all those traditions that I've experienced only as a student out the window, and let me just try to do things differently. As you'll hear in a little bit, it did not always go perfectly smoothly. So certainly my emboldenedness was not justified in any way whatsoever. But I did anyway, and so now it gives me 5 years of having experimented with it that I can share with you as we go through. I'm going to group some of these activities and different things that I've done in my classrooms into 2 different categories. The first one is the one that I felt really that I knew quite a bit about, was around public knowledge. So I knew from the perspective of someone doing research around promoting open access, being involved in that open access space, that there was a value in public knowledge and that there was different things that we could do to just increase the public knowledge that's available. So the first thing that I do in my classrooms, and this is sort of a no-brainer for me, is that I only assign readings that are open and publicly available. And I talk about that in the classrooms when I do it. So I not only just tell them, like, wait, first of all, there's not going to be anything that you have to pay for to access resources for this class, right? It might be a little easier for me to do in the subjects that I teach. So I teach in a publishing studies program. I teach technologies of publishing. There's a lot of sort of looking at popular media and popular press about things going on the web. But I actually strongly believe, and this is from my work doing open access, that it's possible to find openly available resources for any subject, both either as open educational resources themselves, right, as like actual open textbooks, but otherwise even just research articles. You can always find alternatives. You can always find something else. It does involve a little bit more work from the perspective of the instructor, depending on your subject area, to be able to find resources that are appropriate for the students to learn from and that are publicly available. And here I don't restrict myself to having to access it directly from if it's going to be a journal article at the journal's website, if it's available in an institutional repository, as long as there's a free version available that I can link the students to, and I talk about the fact that we are accessing, that everything that's assigned to them has been made, is things that are freely available. If they weren't registered at school, that they would have access. And I use it as an opportunity to talk about the access and the privilege that they would have normally by being in an institution to gain access to those resources that they don't, that in my class, they're accessing the same resources that their parents or that their siblings could be accessing from beyond. So I do this sort of in part to show that there's that there are valuable open access resources, right? So like the fact that that OA is there and available, but I also make a point of picking readings that are not just peer-reviewed academic research, just to show them what things that are written in the popular press and things that are written out sort of without that academic lens also have useful things to teach us, and that those are actually the things that are being put out there in different forms are available to them, are also resources that they can learn from. And that if we start dissecting them and talking about them and discussing them, that you can dig deeper into anything, even if it's not the primary peer-reviewed research literature as sources. So I don't restrict myself to those. The second thing that I do is and this is, I think, a very important part, is I have students post all of their assignments publicly, right? The only thing I tell them is that I will only accept the URL as a submission, right? So they need to send me whatever they can. I tell them that they can, this obviously, first of all, works well because in my classes, people are primarily doing writing, right? That's what they're submitting to me. And so again, if you're coming from different disciplines where the assignments are not sort of written pieces, then you might have to think about different alternative models about what it means to send you publicly available assignments. And I can't do this with every assignment, everything that they do in my classes. Sometimes they do projects and presentations or other hands-on things. But for anything that's sort of like an essay, a short excerpt, a reading response, whatever it is that they're sending to me, I say, you have to submit a URL to me. My goal here sort of doing this is multiple. First, it gets them to think about where content could go, right? It's like around like where, if I wanted to share some writing, where could I post it, right? And so here I've given them different options, right? I've told them that I used to be involved in a site called Winnower, which is sort of a little bit now defunct, where they could make something that looked like an academic paper, but it was really just a blog post. I tell them they can set up their own blog. I've set up a blog for them and that I host, that I give them an account to if they want. But I've also had students sort of create a Tumblr account, and then they post their content on Tumblr. It's been kind of interesting to see actually over the few years I've been here, sort of where students like Tumblr was like, it was a bit of a more, like Tumblr's been around for ages. You know, it's like sort of like it's a sort of a type of blogging platform. In the last couple of years, sort of it's kind of regaining in popularity as there's like a bit of some subcultures that are sort of happening within Tumblr blogs, and the students are choosing to put some of their content there. But for me, it's not important where they would put it, but it's just actually getting them to think, if I have an idea to share, where could I share it? And there's a lot of students that really want to, that really just wanted me to give them a blog and a place to host it. And don't want to create their own space, but some students go off and want to create their own space to share their ideas. And it's just, again, just about giving them a chance to do so. The second thing that getting them to post their assignments publicly is that I also get to give them feedback in an open public way. The way that happens when you post things on the internet, there's a comment section at the bottom that you can write some things back to. So actually, by being able to write and give them feedback and responses in the comments, again, this serves its own multiple purposes. One is that I get them to, and I also get them to peer review each other's work and give each other feedback on these things that are publicly available, which has the advantage that A, gets them to read each other's work, right? But also as they get feedback from their peers, and for me, they are exposed to sort of what it's like to sort of receive public critique. And as they have to themselves give feedback to others, it gets them to kind of really think about what does it mean to give a critique or to comment when if you're thinking about, well, I know that this critique is going to be publicly available, so it's not the same as going off in some room like in the dark and sort of critiquing somebody's work without them being aware of it, or without anyone knowing that you're saying all of these mean things. It sort of gets you to think, how do I need to frame my feedback in a way that I feel comfortable having people from outside read, right? And also they know that they're going to be walking into their classroom and having to look at this person in the face the next time that they come in on the next week, right? So it also starts putting, it starts humanizing this walls of text that you sort of find on the internet, and gets you to think about the fact that there's somebody behind that text, right? And so in the space of a classroom, this is something that they sort of will know each other, depending on how it could be. They might know each other well, or they might just at least know that they're going to need to interact with one another. And so it starts to, again, just helps them to sort of teaches and helps them to learn that that as you're doing these kind of commentary, writing, putting your ideas out, giving feedback or critique out in public, that starts giving them that lens of how to do so in a way that's constructive, in a way that's mindful of the person whose work you are critiquing. And especially as they're going to get their feedback from me, sort of in all of the feedback that I give them, the only thing that I withhold and I give privately is their grades, which I send, like what letter I assign to it, I give them privately. But everything else that I tell them about their assignment, I do so in a public forum. And so it also just gets them used to being like, yes, when you put your ideas out there, sometimes they get critiqued. And sometimes they're getting critiqued, and not necessarily from the perspective of thinking about them being assessed, but just like my idea is being challenged. And so just, again, giving them exposure to those things. This is something, again, that we can do in any classroom, and no matter what the topic is. You can start teaching about these sort of principles of democratic engagement and public participation and public knowledge as just part of the everyday practice. The last bit that I do really around public knowledge, and this is something that I actually learned as a student from my own supervisor, John Walensky, who actually asked the students to not just do their assignments publicly, but actually make a public, so he frames it sort of as make a public contribution to knowledge, right? And you give them some options around what this could look like. So one is like go off and comment on a news story. Like write a meaningful, substantive response or feedback on a news story about the topic that that's relevant to the class. Or work on Wikipedia, like go and write a Wikipedia or edit a Wikipedia entry. Find a place online where you can share your ideas, your knowledge, what you've learned, your thinking of what we're doing in the class within a public sphere. This last semester, I actually tried using the Wikipedia Education Project as a way of really structuring, because I found students really struggled with the Wikipedia. Actually contributing to Wikipedia is a very daunting, much more daunting task than I had myself appreciated. And as I've gotten feedback from students that, or just noticing that few students were taking that option, I tried to really use the Wikipedia Education Project, where Wikipedia really provides quite a bit of scaffolding and sort of materials to help students to do this. And in this semester, they actually still found it to be quite a bit of work. Actually, a bunch of them sort of bailed on doing the Wikipedia assignment because they came in near the end of the term and just said, could we make that part of the course optional, because they were just really struggling, because it actually takes a lot of time to make a very meaningful contribution on a site like Wikipedia, and there's a lot going on there. But actually a handful of students did succeed at doing so. But the point is, for me, is actually to structure an assignment that really is about getting them to think about, you have ideas that are worth sharing, and that you have knowledge that other people don't have. Your perspective is a perspective that others could benefit from. Go out there and put it into the public sphere somehow, and just see how people react. The second part that so that's sort of this is sort of the public knowledge aspects. Again, these are things that it's just a few of the things that I've sort of have tried to do. The second aspect, the second line of sort of thinking are sort of how to actually make the classroom itself more democratic. How do we model and practice within the classroom space and remove sort of the more like the tyranny dynamic that exists in a classroom, where the person at the front has all of the power and the students have none? How do we get them to participate democratically in shaping the discussions and the conversations that are going on in the classroom? So something that I think is pretty commonly done in seminars, I have students sort of lead seminars of their choosing, right? So this is probably something that probably wouldn't be seen as too sort of controversial or different, or many people wouldn't even think of as democratic, but actually just as a chance of having the students take the leadership role. And so I let them come to me for advice around what it is that we should assign for readings and what it is that things should go, but I actually get them to pick the readings that we're doing for that week themselves. So often I'll try to provide them with like a list of a very long list of things that they could choose from, and then the students, sort of like once leading that week, will have to read everything that I have on that long list, but then they can choose which are the things that are most that they think are most relevant, that really speaks to them the most, that they think that their peers would try to would understand and would actually relate with most. And I try to encourage them to pick activities and sort of guide, like, of how are they going to structure the class itself, right? So it really isn't just about coming in and presenting on the topic, as I think is commonly done, but rather set up the whole classroom dynamic however you want in activities. And some interesting challenges that come up when you try to get students who themselves are not experienced teaching to try to sort of lead very different kinds of dynamics. But this sort of leading your own class, although that's commonly done, what I try to do is actually pair it with actually having the students also create their own syllabus. Right? So it's like, it's all fine and good if you tell them these are the topics. You know, it's like you can choose whatever you want, whatever color you want, as long as it's black, right? And then the student says, actually, black's not a color. And so, but you have, I actually get them to try to create, I've experimented with having students create their own syllabus. I did this in my second year here. I started experimenting with trying to do this. You start off the first week with like, you say, here's the syllabus. It contains a course description, and it contains the little notes at the bottom that talk about academic integrity. And then you say, okay, what are we going to do in this class? And you spend the whole first sort of 3-hour block of time saying, what are the topics that we need to discuss? And you try to structure dynamics and conversations around picking the content for the course. It's, again, this is I'll talk a little bit about some of sort of the challenges of trying to put any of these things into actual practice. But the idea, and this is something I took from the Haystack community, which I actually thought it was pronounced hashtag, but then Kathy Davidson, who runs this community, was here last week or the week before, and then I heard her pronounce it Haystack, so SHASTAC. And there's a whole community, sort of a bunch of blog posts that I found very useful where they talked about this. I was like, this seems like a great way of actually saying, like, you know, it's not just come in and pick out of the list of things I've given you which one do you want to lead, but rather which are the topics that you want to have in this class in the first place. Here you're pushing really against a lot of what this, like they're really pushing against that dynamic that I'm the expert that's going to tell you what it is that you need to learn. There's a lot of work involved in trying to structure that conversation, and it's actually, this is probably the most challenging thing that I've tried to do in the classroom, is trying to arrive at a syllabus that they're happy with and that I'm happy with, because they feel like they don't know what it is that they don't know, right? So they want me to tell them. And so as soon as I start telling them, they're like, yes, that sounds good. And then I give a second topic, they're like, yes, that sounds good. And then we just start filling my syllabus. And then I think, well, I could have just done this at home. It would have been a lot faster. But I have tried to do this in different ways. So one is actually just starting completely from scratch. And I found that to be really challenging around getting the students to be able to propose what are the topics that we should have. And then it creates a whole bunch of work for me of then going off and helping to provide adequate number of resources for each of those topics. That needs to happen in the 7 days between the first meeting and the second meeting. And so that I've sort of tried once, and it was exhausting, and I don't think terribly successful, so I dropped off. The second time I started with a syllabus, and I said, well, now here's what I'm proposing as a starting point, and here's a whole bunch of extra topics. How do you want to change the syllabus? Right? And I even walk away from the classroom and I leave them to work on their own for a while so that they can really, I come back and they've like changed one topic, right? And so this is, but I really just trying to give them, there's a couple of things that I'm trying to do with trying to do these things. Again, I don't think I've actually been successful at getting students to create their own syllabus well, but what I'm trying to really do with a lot of these things is give them a real sense that the course is theirs, right? That they're in charge of their learning. They can choose what are the topics, they can decide what they want to, what it is that they want to learn, and trying to encourage them to really think about participating in the classroom in a way that isn't as a consumer of what it is that I'm there to offer, but rather as someone that wants, as a group of people that want to sort of help and learn from each other. I've done other things, so parts, there's different, that's like with the core content of the syllabus, like the course outline, but I've also had students be able to choose and pick how much each assignment is worth. So I'm like, okay, here's the menu of things that you can do for this course, right? So it's like you can write essays, that are various lengths. You can peer review each other's work. You can participation. How much do you want each of these assignments to be worth? Right? And part of doing that is, again, letting students range from 0, like I don't want to do that assignment at all. I want to have 100% of my grade be participation, or I've tried to give them some limits within that. But again, it's letting them focus, where do they want to focus their attention and energies. I've tried doing contract grading, where I'm like, okay, well, if that's, the students are, instead of just picking and choosing a menu from the courses, what are the, if you want an A, do all of these things. If you want a B, do this smaller list of things, and having everything graded as satisfactory, not satisfactory. Again, helping them to say, what do you want to focus your attention on? How do you make this course something that you're going to benefit from because you want to? Every single student contracted for an A, because this is, again, they're a product of an education system where they are really needing that credential and that validation. We're pushing back against a lot of these things. I've done last semester negotiated grading, right? So where I'm like, okay, again, trying to push the emphasis away from grades and having them come say, look, we're going to talk at the end of the term, you're going to come and meet with me. We'll talk about what grade you should get. You tell me what you think you should get. I'll tell you if I think you're on the right ballpark or not. Trying to take the emphasis away from that evaluative aspect and saying this can be a conversation. This is something that we can sort of try to agree on. And I've tried to do students have very open, sort of open-ended assignments where I really don't give students a rubric. I'm like, I don't give them a length. They ask you how long it should be. I paint them a graph that if I had a blackboard, I would show you. It's just like I've correlated grades. This is my quantitative side. I've correlated length of essay to grades. And you can sort of show them that the really short ones typically don't do so well because the student didn't have too much to say. The really long ones tend to be pretty good because it's a student that really had a lot to say. But in the middle, it's really kind of all over the place. So like in the, depending on, so that you can just kind of give them that sense of how far they are on one side or the other. And so we can, and then the final button, which I won't spend any time really talking about, but it really is my favorite. I spent all of last year as a Dewey Fellow here at university talking about social annotation, which Esteban is going to give you a short little talk on in the afternoon, so I won't dwell on it very much. But just to say that it has all kinds of, I think, pedagogical advantages around helping them sort of leave comments and having conversations on the text on the side of the readings, But the part that I put this under the democratic category of things is because what it does is, again, it helps them to have conversations and engaging with ideas in a public way or in a forum where they're discussing with one another and learning that they are in this learning thing together and that they're learning from one another and helping them to think about what comment should I leave that's going to be helpful to my peers. Right? Now, what comment should I leave that's going to help me understand and help us all be a part of it? So it builds a community of learning around these things. Okay, so I know I realize I'm sort of getting a little bit close to being out of time. So I promised you I would give you some of my, I'd give you some of the feedback that I've had from trying out some of these different practices. There's a whole bunch of resources, like in the Haystack community, for how you actually try to put these things into practice. Very few places actually talk about whether these things are actually allowed, right? So it's like, is it okay to ask your students to post all of their assignments publicly? Is giving them the opportunity to use a pseudonym enough to sort of get around any regulations? Can you, do you have to give them space on a university server for them to do so? If a student doesn't want to, for a legitimate reason, what do you do then? And most importantly, what if I ask and I get told I'm not allowed to do them, right? So my strategy has just really been, and it's unfortunate it's being recorded, because my strategy has really been just to not ask, right? And there's really so this is talking a little bit about the risks of doing some of these things. You can try out all of these things, but really I'm doing it without understanding or knowing whether or not this is actually in following sort of university regulations and policies. And to be honest, have genuinely been afraid of asking, because I feel like if I ask conservative voices, and they will be like, well, just in case, let's not try to do these things. And then I'll have to just stop trying or trying to find ways around it. So it's just some of the initial sort of challenges. I also haven't learned, there's how complicated it is to do some of these things around the classroom. For myself, I sort of struggled, but I also have realized how much I've learned over the last 5 years. As the last semester, I tried to encourage other faculty to do online annotations, which for me has been an incredibly successful, that's like one of these pieces that's gone very well every year, is the online annotation component. And I tried to get faculty to experiment with that. This semester, I had 6 different courses running it, where I was providing them some support. And I realized how much I sort of have learned how to set this up, how to motivate it, how to get it going, has been something that I've figured out, but I wasn't even necessarily aware of which are the practices of the things that I do, which are part of my personality and part of my motivations and my background in public knowledge, were important to the success of those initiatives. So when I saw other people sort of trying to experiment with these things in their classroom, started seeing what some of the, made visible to me what the challenges are, even in the practices that to me came more naturally, and that maybe for other people the challenges would be different. So I promised you sort of the version of celebrity reads mean tweets version of this. So I'm going to read you a little bit of some of the feedback that I've gotten from doing these in the classroom, lest you think that open pedagogy and open practices are all just happy moments. So Juan is a very engaging instructor that knows his subject matter very well. Started off well. I am sympathetic with the fact that many students weren't open to having their views challenged, but I think that this course could have been structured in a different way. A more typical seminar format would probably have helped, right? So that's okay. Overall, it seemed that Juan was trying to make the class more open, interactive, and flexible, but this didn't happen. It was far too academic. I found Hypothesis useful. Hypothesis is the tool for online annotations, but I didn't have any more comments to add in class, right? So they really felt like, okay, that was nice, but then when I came into class, nothing to. Juan generally operates under a principle of maximum freedom, minimum clarity. The professor set up things in a purposeful way, but was not very good at explaining that purpose. And then one that I receive over and over again, 5 years in, all the classrooms, I cannot get away from expectations were often unclear, or the million variants of what that looks like, which students really find frustrating. I try to give this flexibility, give them the opportunity to really set up the classroom how they want. And what they want to be told, and what they tell me time and time again, is that they want expectations to be clear. They want to be told how to do it. They want a structure. They want a rubric. They want it. Not every student, but every single one of my courses that I've taught has like a chunk of the evaluations that have that kind of comment. When I was reviewed for the job, and so I know that I'm getting close to the end of time, so I'm just going to wrap up in just a couple of minutes. When I was reviewed 1.5 years into the job, like I told you, I sort of decided to try to do this from the very get-go. I received my first sort of salary review 1.5 years. It was all very positive and good. Everything was great. Under the course and instructor evaluations, it's the section around my teaching, it said, the course and instructor evaluation scores were quite varied in its first 3 terms. The cause for the variability in these scores is not easily pinpointed, but some variation might be expected in the first 2 teaching terms of his career, especially given the heavy teaching load and service load, blah, 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 see below. It is apparent that his energy and enthusiasm for teaching, and for his students works well for him. He is responsive and interested to try out new things in the classroom. On arrival, he immediately set about redesigning 2 courses with doing all of these things, right? And substantially updated a 3rd. All right, so then a little bit about, like, in 2015, he introduced hypothesis in both the undergrad and graduate courses with some success. We look forward to seeing publications that reports on these experiences. So here already, it's like, that worked well. Like, let's see you do more with that. The committee unanimously recommends blah, 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 with a note that some aspects of his file might call for greater recognition. That said, the committee further noted that future reviews would be contingent on better teaching evaluations. So here is like a direct impact on not receiving the score. Like, some aspects of my work would have been calling for a bigger recommendation, but the experimentation and the variability, because of the challenges in implementation, had a direct tangible effect on the step increases that I received that year. And I say that not to sort of, the review was like positive. John Maxwell, the director of the program, was like, the letter is super kind and generous in so many ways. But this line sort of stuck with me, because what it told me was that if I hadn't tried to experiment and try to have all this variability, it's like there's a tangible economic effect on my career. And so doing this thing comes at a risk. Comes at a risk because students is pushing back on student challenges, right? There's a kind of feedback and critique from the students that also comes that I consider to be, it's a critique from the perspective, and it lowers the scores on the evaluations, but I consider to be a success, right? I feel this project was very self-taught, and that could be improved, right? Like, a student tells you, like, I was like, yes, that was the point. Like, I tried to get you to teach it to yourself, right? The instructor covered content by leaving us to work it out mostly for ourselves. But it's like, I believe that was the point. Like, the students, so they recognize it, right? But when they ask that question in the evaluation, they say, I didn't deliver the course content, right? How successful was the instructor at delivering course content? Not too successful. He did not deliver the course. We did. Right? But it's a critique, and they mark, like, they put it down on the number, but then the comment, I was like, I did it right? And so I want to finish off by reading one of the positive evaluations. The ones that made me, this is from the Making Knowledge Public course that I did. It was a whole course of students that self-selected because they were interested in these democratic ideals. And when we set up a course both around learning about these, so first, in fact, we have students that care about these issues and that wanted to select into a class for doing so. But I want to read, because this is sort of one of those comments that sort of gets me to think that there is something here that we have an opportunity to do that really goes beyond just delivering content to students and helping them to advance and move forward in their careers. It's a little bit long, but I just want to sort of get to it. The student said, you really challenged my thinking around the responsibility to contribute rather than to just consume in the public debate. I have a tendency to err on the side of keeping quiet with my opinions in lots of contexts, and then she puts in brackets, except maybe in this class, because she actually was quite a talkative student, mainly because I have a hard time saying or implying that someone else is wrong. This class made me reevaluate my role and consider the perspective that it is actually also a responsibility of people with education and expertise to share rather than hoarding that knowledge to themselves. It is hard to balance to be generous with one's knowledge and experience without crossing the line into arrogance, snobbery, and judgmentalism. But this class made me rethink what educational privilege is and how not participating in public debate and dialogue is just as much a symptom of elitist snobbery as the opposite pole of being too vocal and critical. I think like this, I think there are other, sometimes less explicit, but sort of equally rewarding messages that I hear about the kinds of things that we're doing in the classroom. I think open education is just one piece of this very complex puzzle, but I also think that it can be a starting point for giving students a sense that their knowledge is a public good, and that we are all better off when they share it. If we can foster it in our own classrooms, this notion that education is a public good whose benefits should be accrued by society and not just by the individuals, then I think that we can walk back this prevailing notion that education is some commodity that's to be traded. We can instead, I think, create spaces where thinking, exploring, and sharing knowledges will thrive. I'm convinced that by doing so, we're going to serve the students sort of better as well as our society. And perhaps this is a lofty goal for sort of a middling, mediocre instructor, but it's one that I deeply believe that is both important and one that I think that we can achieve. And I look forward to sort of having a conversation and learning from all of you how we might sort of achieve that together. Thank you.